Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Lamont. Welcome to the Tassiszaal here in the heart of the University of Antwerp and also in the heart of the city of Antwerp for the conferral of the last honorary degree for 20 and 22. My name is Anke. I'll be your hostess this afternoon in this beautiful location, and I'm really grateful and delighted to be surrounded by so much knowledge, hard work, and incredible talent and intelligence. Honorary Dr. Michèle Lamont will shortly be teaching a masterclass about recognition in the new Gilded Age. During the masterclass, you can ask questions using the chat function on YouTube, and this is for the people watching online. After the masterclass, there will be time for a Q&A session in which Professor Lamont will answer the questions you submitted, and of course also the questions from you here in this room. Then we will proceed to the conferral of the honorary degree. But first, I would like to give the floor to Professor Petra Meijer, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, who will offer you all a warm welcome.
Dear Honorary Dr. Lamont, dear Dr. Dobbin, dear Chancellor van Goethem, dear Nominator Verschragen, guests, colleagues and friends. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you in the name of the Faculty of Social Sciences to this honorary degree ceremony today. I'm particularly pleased that we can have this ceremony in a setting allowing us to have Dr. Lamont and her husband amongst us. But I'm even more pleased to have the honor to welcome you here today, Dr. Lamont. It is always a special occasion to award honorary degrees, because we do not do that every day. We do so to you, however, Dr. Lamont, because you have the profile that brings to bear everything a Faculty of Social Sciences aspires to. I always say that a Faculty of Social Sciences should be a social faculty. And we attempt to be a Faculty of Social Sciences doing research and providing teaching about society, for society, and with society. Social sciences investigate big and small issues societies are confronted with, struggle with, try to deal with. We study issues of war and peace, international and social conflicts, poverty, and the redistribution, or not, of wealth, social exclusion, discrimination, marginalization, how boundaries get established, reproduced, racism, ageism, sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity, dignity, respect, or the lack thereof. Our research investigates close to all aspects of social life, from birth rates, over partnerships, social contacts, new forms of communication, miscommunication in everyday life, to school career patterns, participation in the labor market, housing, healthcare issues, pensions, mortality rates, and some, the course of life. Social science research also covers all levels of society, from the micro level of the individual to the macro level of state architectures and beyond, supra-international social and political evolutions. Social sciences, in a nutshell, are interested in the compass of society. Dear public, my colleague Gert Verschragen will situate Dr. Lamont's work in a minute, but I would like to pay tribute to your work as it reflects in an eminently excellent way what the social sciences stand for. Your work is about society, for society, and with society. Your work shows your high degree of concern for where society is going and how the compass of society is disoriented, I would be tempted to say, out of order. While social scientists should not seek to be policymakers, we have, or should have, a critical mind and eye to dare and propose options and alternatives. We certainly do not have magic recipes, but our work should offer tools, be they concepts, be they theories, as well as hands-on proposals that help to move forward and make our world a better place to live in. Your CV reflects this ambition and capacity in various ways, not the least by having a very self-reflective position on how the social sciences operate, on what we do as scholars, on what our central interests and motivations are, and how we do it. These are the reasons why we are, so pleased to have the honor to welcome you here today, Dr. Lamont. Respect, my respect, and our respect, Dr. Lamont. I would now like to hand over the floor to your nominator, colleague Gert Verschragen, from our Department of Sociology. Thank you.
Esteemed Rector Van Goethem, Dean Meijers, Dr. Lamont, dear colleagues and guests with us today, I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the masterclass of Dr. Michèle Lamont, which is titled What We Value, Redefining Word in the New Gilded Age. Dear Dr. Lamont, if I may, I would like to briefly introduce you to our public. It is not that you and your work require a lot of introduction. You are widely regarded as one of the most influential and most important sociologists living today. You have worked on a wide range of topics, including culture and equality, racism and discrimination, the workings of academia, and the nature of social scientific knowledge. Your many books and scientific publications on each of these themes have inspired scholars throughout the globe. While your sociological work is thoroughly academic, you've also made important contributions to the public debate, not only in the United States and Canada, but also in Europe. It will not surprise that we are not the first to honor you. You have received honorary doctorates from 6 countries and have also won, among others, the Gutenberg Research Award and the 2017 Erasmus Prize, the latter for your exceptional contributions to social science and your continued emphasis on the importance of tolerance and cultural pluralism. Dear public, Michèle Lamont is Professor of Sociology and of African and African American Studies, as well as the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies, all at Harvard University. She served as the 108th President of the American Sociological Association in 2016, 2017, chaired the Council for European Studies for 3 years, and was recently co-chairing the advisory board to the 2021-22 UN Human Development Report. Michèle Lamont grew up in multilinguistic Quebec in Canada, yet developed an academic career in the United States, and she has often mentioned how being in between languages, cultures, and countries has helped her to better understand the internal logics of different societies and to see how people in various places value things differently. So it's only logical that she became one of the founding mothers, so to say, of comparative cultural sociology, the comparative study of how individuals in different countries use specific cultural repertoires to define themselves and to make sense of the societies in which they live. For instance, in her first book, Money, Morals and Manners, written in 1992, Lamont compared how people in the upper middle class in France and the United States defined themselves in very different ways. A more recent example is the co-authored book, Getting Respect, which compared how people experience and respond to racism very differently in the US, Brazil, and Israel. The title of this last book, Getting Respect, nicely indicates what her work in the last decade has focused on. Dear Dr. Lamont, in the past years, you have argued many times that social scientists need to analyze more closely the social process of recognition, which you define as the process through which people are defined as valuable, as people who matter in our societies. And this focus has been central to your work. You've tried to understand how societies have given recognition to some groups, but not to other groups, and have investigated what tools our societies have to ensure that historically marginalized or low-status groups can achieve greater inclusion, greater recognition. Your work could obviously not be more timely. Both in North America and Europe, a growing number of groups, be it women, African Americans, LGBTQ people, or workers experiencing downward social mobility, all these groups have been making recognition claims as they protest unfair treatment and ask to be treated with dignity, with equal dignity and respect. And this is, of course, epitomized by several social movements that have made claims for cultural membership and social inclusion. Black Lives Matter or the Me Too campaign are only the most important examples. In your latest upcoming book, which is also the starting point of your masterclass, you study how our current societies are undergoing important changes in how they deal with diversity and with these recognition claims. You have interviewed, quote, agents of change, unquote, in the US, so people who are actively working towards transforming how we understand who matters in society. And by empirically studying the narratives of these agents of change, you argue that we are in a very special historical moment where much is changing in how our societies are producing and redistributing recognition. But I do not want to spoil the content of your masterclass. Dr. Lamont, dear Michèle, we are more than curious to hear what you have to say about these changing narratives of recognition and hope. And before we start, I would like to remind the public present here that there will be an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. And for those who are watching this online and would like to ask Michèle Lamont a question, they can send their questions through the chat box. Dr. Lamont, the floor is yours, please.
Dear Rector, dear Dean, dear colleague, dear students, and dear friends, it's a great honor to be here today. I'm absolutely thrilled. I will thank Geert for his kind comments, as well as the Dean, after my talk. But for now, let me describe to you what my work is about, and I look forward to your comments and reactions. I am going to talk to you about a book that I'm in the process of finishing. I'm really in the middle of it. And I will start by asking you to listen to a clip from an interview that I conducted with a Hollywood creative. And I'll explain to you who she is, or they are, after we've heard the interview.
Think about how your work has influenced the direction of what's happening in Hollywood now. I mean, there's not many shows that have trans people, you know. So how do you think about things changing? Or
yeah, I do see a lot changing right now. I do see a lot of things sort of like transparent out there. And yesterday I was on a phone call with some philanthropists and some activists and some writers where we were all talking about the political power of protagonism and the creating of your own propaganda, because you're making more people like you. And so we need to make a world where people focus on, love for the other rather than ridiculing the other.
For Joyce Soloway, who is one of the creators of the show Transparent, which features a middle-aged trans man who decides that he needs to live his identity as a woman, and he negotiates with his adult children what does this mean, and at the same time the creator's goal is to make more understandable and less abhorrent to the people, to the population, to the viewers, what it means to be a trans person. So Joyce Soloway is one of many cultural creators who are working toward the transformation of the identity of groups who have been historically marginalized. So this is largely the story that I will be telling you today. And I will argue that at a time when growing inequality is making it increasingly more difficult for people to find hope, we need more and more people like Joyce Soloway to provide us new sources of hope. The American dream does not deliver anymore, and new groups are very busy trying to make us understand what a more desirable society could look like. So the outline of my talk will really be in two parts. First, I will be describing the cultural dead end that the United States is experiencing right now, with the predominant script of self that has pushed us to focus increasingly on competitiveness and on valuing people's worth through socioeconomic success, which is feeding an important mental health crisis across the social spectrum among the upper middle class, but also with the working class, which is experiencing the opioid crisis. And the second part will talk about solution, and by looking at these agents of change, as well as college students in the Midwest and the East Coast, where my research team and I conducted interviews. And the goal is really, it's a book that I'm writing for Trade Press, my first book that aims to provide citizens, the reading public, with tools to understand what recognition is about, with the goal of creating conversations about how to create a society that is more inclusive. And I will conclude by talking about a few possible strategies that we could develop and that are inspired by the work of the people that I've interviewed. So recognition is very much about who is legit, who is defined as respectable. So here you have the person with the t-shirt that says, I see you, is a trans person. This phrase, I see you, is very important to the Gen Zs, those who are today between 18 and 25. And it's really a claim of recognition, but also of proclaiming the right to be who one is. And the other t-shirt is summarizes or captures a poster that you can see on many lawns in the US following the Black Lives Matter, which proclaims the universal experience that we have as human beings. No human is illegal, love is love. So these are messages that have to do with ordinary universalism, what we all have in common as a human being. So the project draws on a larger study that I conducted in collaboration with a group of social scientists from a range of disciplines. We met 3 times a year for 19 years, and the second book that we produced together is titled Social Resilience in the Neoliberal Era, and the goal is very much to learn how institutions and cultural repertoires are enabling us to produce recognition. And it's very much in tension with the focus on individual grit, the ability of individuals to pull themselves by their britches. Here we really need to think about how we can create societies that are more empowering. An example of this is the same-sex marriage law. In the 32 states where these laws have been passed a few years ago, we found that there was a very clear decline in the number of attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth in high school, which tells us that these laws not only allowed people to marry who they wanted, but also sent clear messages that LGBTQ people were legit, that they mattered. And that's what the result that I described can be explained as. So in order to conduct this study, my students and I conducted interviews with 80 stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives to try to understand how they go about doing their work, the ways in which they contribute to creating narratives of hope. And we also did these 80 interviews with college students in the Midwest and the Northeast. And these interviews were conducted during COVID, including during the summer of 2020, during the peak of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I will start by defining this concept of recognition. Some of you may be familiar with it. It has become very influential. The work of Axel Honneth, a German philosopher, has shed a lot of light on it. He defines it as the social act by which the positive social work of an individual or group is affirmed or acknowledged by others. And the parallel concept is the concept of stigmatization, defined by Erving Goffman, a sociologist, as the process that consists in qualifying negatively identities and differences. Both of them aim really at broadening cultural citizenship, which can be defined as how social actors understand themselves as similar or different to one another, and the accompanying understanding of the social obligation entailed in these relationships of similarity and differences. Whereas Hannette defines it as an act, I define it as a cultural process that is unfolding in the context of our everyday life. This is very important to the extent that we have a growing literature that is about nudging and priming. Instead of focusing on these very specific moments where people are presented probes that are supposed to help them become aware of their behavior, instead I focus on everyday life as it unfolds and the intersubjective definition of value that we produce together in the course of our interactions and experiences. Recognition matters a lot. Many people have argued that it is just a distraction from more serious claims that people may make concerning poverty, access to resources. I'm not denying in any way that access to resources matters, but I adopt a multi-dimensional approach to inequality, which also makes place for recognition. And concretely, we know that recognition matters because, for instance, people who suffer from racism, there's been a lot of research showing that African Americans, as they experience the microaggression in the context of their everyday life, come to experience also major health disparities that are associated with the wear and tear of everyday life, of experiencing both inequality and racism. It also matters for material resources. Think of LGBTQ youth who are not accepted by their parents. They may become homeless. So this is a case where poverty, or rather stigmatization, creates poverty. So the causal link between recognition and poverty can be going in both directions. It also matters for how the low-income people experience themselves in society. We know that in Scandinavian societies, in Denmark and Sweden in particular, the poor are not as deeply stigmatized as they are in the US. So it means very different things to be a poor person in both societies. And since the election of Donald Trump, of course, we know that stigmatization matters a great deal for politics, since one of the groups that was most supportive of him were downwardly mobile working class men who embraced his ethno-nationalism as a way to raise their status. So we need to understand better how to deal with recognition. So to turn now to the summary of the book, let's start with neoliberalism, which is the context in which we have been living since the early 80s. Often people date the beginning of its growing influence to the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and you see here a graph that demonstrates the spread of the term neoliberalism in the news, both in the UK, in Europe, sorry, and the United States. And you can see that it has gained speed over the last 10, 15 years. It's often defined as operating at 4 level. I'm sorry, I'm working simultaneously on 2 screens here. So at the economic level, it's defined in terms of market mechanisms, the idea that we need to remove all the mechanisms that would hinder the market from functioning fully. So this means that the role of the state is to make sure that profit-making animates society. You have the audit society, which is equated with the new public management. We experience, for instance, in universities, growing the increase in how often we are asked to account for our productivity and the use of quantitative measures of our quality as faculty members. But the dimension that preoccupies me most here has to do with the scripts of self, which are the shared definition that we operate with concerning who's valuable. And the neoliberal scripts of self focuses on self-reliance, the notion that we should not depend on others, privatization of risk. It's not the role of the state to keep us out of trouble. And the evaluation of status that is centered around socioeconomic success. And also the importance of competitiveness and meritocracy, which goes with it, which says that those who are at the top of the social structure are there because of their intelligence and hard work. So there's no room for domination, exploitation. We could not, through this framework, understand why that African Americans were underpaid historically forever in the American context. So Trump is here not because he represents perfectly the neoliberal scripts of self. There are some values that he embraces, such as protectionism, that are incompatible with neoliberalism, but he certainly celebrated entrepreneurialism, competition, the value of money. So in some ways, his election very much symbolized the hegemony of neoliberal self, and the way that people evaluate their own worth, and it becomes increasingly salient. It's hard to measure how much this scripts of self has diffused, but we can look at data on the growing salience of meritocracy across a number of countries. So Jonathan Misch has studied exactly that, and he found that between 1930 and 2010, people came to believe much more in meritocracy, and you can see on this graph that it's much more salient in the United States and the United Kingdom, in Germany than in France. And in fact, when we compare all the countries that he studied, he found an increase in all but 5 of the 23 countries, with a decrease only in Austria, Canada, and France. So you can see the rapidity of these changes. And I will propose that we need to think about what new scripts of self we should operate with. And this is particularly important given the growing inequality that we've experienced over the last decades. It's much harder for our children to meet our social status than it was a few decades ago if they are the middle-class families. Yet we have this paradoxical situation where the American dream continues to a number of people continue to believe in, despite the evidence that they have from their own experience and that of others, that upward mobility cannot be easily achieved. And the continuous success of this notion of American dream can be explained by the fact that it's a very ambiguous notion. So if it means for some people equate it with having a good family, so who doesn't want a good family? Yet it remains very much connected with the notion of economic achievement, the ability to be prosperous, and it's very particularly popular among immigrants and the non-college educated. In the US, it's largely used as a synonymous for the symbol of cultural citizenship. It is equated with cultural citizenship. It's almost impossible for people to, not fully, at least embrace it at some level. Yet it's very pernicious because it kind of divides the society in 2 parts. The top 20%, professional and managers who are college educated and who embody all these values of competitiveness and socioeconomic success. In contrast, those who are not college educated have become more stigmatized and more hopeless, and they represent 2/3 of the American population, so that is very, very significant. And we have to understand the various social movements, whether Occupy or Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or those workers who support Trump, as in search of recognition. So this is a need that you found across the social structure. The perniciousness of it is also visible in the fact that when you look closely at the domestic situation comedies that are available on American television, content analysis shows that the vast majority of the characters that are presented in these shows are professionals and managers, and the rare times where you see a working class person, they are typically presented as immature, ignorant, irresponsible. So think of the Homer, the father in The Simpsons, as an example. So it's very hard for workers to find positive representation of who they are as they are engaging with entertainment television. This, I argue, feeds an important mental health crisis, which is, is being confirmed and has been greatly accelerated by COVID. And when American adults are surveyed concerning this, they will say that money and work are a great source of stress. This high incidence of mental health problem is partly visible among the non-Hispanic whites, who are precisely the people who should be the winners of the system. And we have different manifestations of this mental health crisis, both at the lower end of the social spectrum, but also at the very top. I don't know if you've experienced this here in Belgium, but it is particularly salient among college students. So this is every year UCLA conducts a freshman survey, and you can see on this graph a pretty sharp increase in the number of students who say that they feel overwhelmed. It is, I know this same trend is present in a number of other countries. So they react this way to increase pressures to become more competitive, and they are quite nervous about the labor market, of course. And this is associated with the pressures that come with the neoliberal scripts of self. So now let's turn to the question of what solutions we may bring to this. And I became very interested, including in the context of COVID, to explore where are the new sources of hope if the American dream is not delivering anymore. So therefore, the story I'm going to tell is really one of cultural production and diffusion. And I argue that these sources of hope depend on narratives, and there are groups that whose job it is to diffuse narratives. So I focus on who are the people who diffuse those narratives, what kind of narratives do they diffuse to make our society more inclusive. And what they're doing is multiplying different scripts of self, especially concerning inclusion. And inclusion is largely coming to replace the American dream, or at least to supplement the American dream. They talk a lot also about everyday cosmopolitanism, which has to do with the fact that there are some things we all share as human beings, so pointing to the similarities between all of us. And there's also a big focus on destigmatizing groups that have been historically marginalized. So to understand how this works, we have to talk briefly about the public sphere, which is a concept that was promoted by Jürgen Habermas, a German philosopher, during the 20th century. He studied it in the earlier centuries as well, and argued that it was essential, this space of common discourse where we could deliberate rationally about the problems, the social problems that we are encountering. And it is, during the 20th century, found in the media market, produced in mass culture, manifested in public opinions, and it depends on technology. Of course, much has changed since the internet has become part of our life, and researchers argue that the public sphere in which we're operating now is drastically different. We now have Twitter, we now have social media, which create very different dynamics. And other changes have happened at other levels, such as the professionalization of nonprofit organizations. The social movements have also developed a very different character with hybrid institutions that are intervening to transform how we think about society. So this here is a representation of what the public sphere looks like. Those circles can be smaller or bigger depending on societies. Some institutions are losing importance. So in the context of the US, religion, labor unions have lost a lot of influence as sources of cultural production, have high quality journalism. But there's other organizations or sectors such as the social media that have gained a lot of influence. So to understand how this has changed, my team and I conducted interviews with people from a wide range of sectors. So to give you a little bit of an idea here, I'm just going to present 2 slides, but there's 185, so there's a lot of people. It includes my colleague, Henry Louis Gates, who has who has really transformed the literary canon in the US, bringing in African-American literature and pointing to the many people who have been ignored, although they made important contribution. Kimberly Crenshaw, who introduced this concept of intersectionality, a number of artists and poets, I'll talk about the artists in a minute, stand-up comics, and religious leaders as well, who each diffuse new scripts about who's worthy, and together all these people really are having an important influence. These are a few other examples of activists who are intervening in various spheres, and also LGBTQ activists and feminists. So that's, we could go on for a while, but in this book I cannot discuss everyone I've interviewed. I'll write a follow-up book that will go much more in depth. So let's take the case of the visual arts. So I happen to have interviewed some Black and queer photographers, both the photographers themselves, but also a literary critic, an art critic rather, and various other people, curators that are contributing to the diffusion of their work. So for instance, I've interviewed Lyle Ashton Harris, and here what you see in this slide is that in his work he tries to provide depiction of this group that he would define as dignified. He tries to provide three-dimensional depiction of these stigmatized group to make them visible, because they're often invisible, and to confirm how they want to see themselves, how they want to be represented. So to give you another example, Catherine Opie, who is a queer photographer, when I interviewed her on her work, she says she wants to represent queer people as having familial intimacy. She wants to make them visible, enable them to see themselves represented again. So she uses modes that are very similar to Lyle Ashton Harris. In an interview magazine, she's part of the leather community in Los Angeles. So she says, I didn't like the way the leather community was being represented in mainstream culture. They think that we're child molesters and everything that's attached to that. We have had a bad rap. That was probably the biggest reason for doing these portraits. I decided to do a body of work that was about being really out, and about being out about my own sexuality, being into S&M and leather and stuff like that. So instead of just showing the tattoos and the piercing and the marking on the body, I wanted to do a series of portraits of this community that were incredibly noble. So you see here a little bit the parallel with the clip with the interview with Joey Soloway that I started the talk with. Another example is an artist named Hank Willis Thomas, who conducted interviews with 150 African-American men living in 12 cities, and he asked everyone the same question: what does it mean for you to be a Black man? And what he found is an enormous diversity in their responses, but what all these men share is the experience of facing stereotype. One of them said, most of what we have in common are the prejudgment that people place on us. So clearly the diversity of this group is missed, and people mostly think of them as being a problem. And there's he produced this video here, which you can see. If you Google Question Bridge on YouTube, you will be able to see this video. And this video was diffused across the country through the help of an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which used its resources to show the video in a great many museums and community centers and school, to get everyone to discuss this problem of the stereotype of the Black man. So they leveraged their resources to scale up the social impact of this new narrative that the artist was developing using their own networks. So when I interviewed Sean Dove, the president of this very powerful organization, he said that what they are trying to do in their work is to create a framework of respect. We were talking about Black men and boys, to not identify people first by the problems and what's wrong with them, as being the face of poverty or the face of crime. They want to define people by their aspiration instead. So that's a shift. So this is an illustration of a very important shift that is happening throughout the philanthropic world, where they have become increasingly committed to transforming narratives. And this is a very significant change because historically the kind of interventions that philanthropy was doing was not oriented toward appealing to hearts and mind, toward using narratives to transform how people represent reality. Economists were often leading the charge, and the focus was more on distributing resources. But now a number of foundations are very much focusing on narrative change, and in the book I argue that we now have recognition chains that are connecting funders, such as the Ford Foundation, or the Campaign for Black Men, to cultural producers with the specific objective to scale up their narratives, the narratives they create, to create social change at a massive scale. So this is a very significant transformation, which has certainly helped with the support for same-sex marriage, for instance. So we also interviewed, as I said earlier, 80 interviews. We did 80 interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood narratives, all kinds of people. For instance, the creators of The Handmaid's Tale, The Good Place, many shows that are extremely popular around among Gen Zs. And we were able to document a number of strategies that they use to create recognition. So we got to a much more specific and detailed understanding of how this works. So one of the most popular strategy, we called it the Trojan horse. And we call it this because they say we don't want to force people to eat their vegetables. We want to diffuse messages about inclusion, but still people are watching stand-up comics to have fun, not to hear sermons. So therefore the message needs to be somewhat subtle and diffused in a light-handed way. And another one is see it to be it. So for instance, African Americans to feel that they are treated as worthy, you need to have actors of color, you need to have producers of color. So this also means that it's very important for them to put people in positions of control. Those who make decisions about casting also need to keep in mind such consideration. There's of all the people we interviewed, only 6 of them believe that they should not use their work to promote diversity, and this is 6 white men who actually think it's a cheap strategy to use comedy or to use these shows as a way to diffuse greater inclusiveness. They are really exceptional in this field. So to continue to tell you a little bit more about what we did here, you have Lizzo, who very influential singer who at the 2020 Grammys stepped on the stage surrounded by a large number of ballet dancers who were large African American women, clearly challenging the stereotype of ballet as an art that was mostly for extremely skinny white women. So Lizzo has become a powerful figure who promotes the body acceptance movement. She is overweight and proud. And this brings me to discuss a little bit an aspect of the book which has to do with the process by which stigma can be reduced and how it has worked in the past and how it can work in the future for other groups. So with 2 of my former graduate students, we did a comparison of people with HIV/AIDS, African Americans, and people who are labeled as obese. And what we found is that the first group was extremely successful in destigmatizing itself. So if you remember, if you were conscious adults in the early 80s, you remember how deeply scared everyone was of HIV/AIDS. And now survey shows us that it's not the case anymore. So how did this very significant change happen? Well, we used secondary data to really trace in detail the process, and we found that for people living with HIV/AIDS, they were able to mobilize the support of many knowledge experts, social scientists, legal scholars, medical scholars, who were ready to accept the notion that anyone can get AIDS. It's not the disease of sexually promiscuous gay man. So they really removed the blame. And you had public figures such as Magic Johnson, who came up and declared publicly that he had AIDS, that it was not a dangerous disease. So really a total reframing of the disease, which basically is accomplished to this kind of pathway that involves social actors, these actors in social movements, but also knowledge workers who create an alliance and draw on surrounding cultural resources, existing ideologies to engage in actions such as removing blame. And this results in a reduction of the public stigma. So this worked for people with HIV/AIDS, but the obese people living with obesity tried to do the same thing, and it didn't work at all, in part because the medical experts were not ready to say that BMI, healthy, the militant were pushing this notion of healthy at any weight, and the medical body did not agree that the BMI did not matter. And of course, people who were obese were perceived as lazy, self-indulgent, lacking self-control. So the destigmatization did not occur. Although in recent years, we've really seen an accentuation of this. You have a publicity campaign, Dove, for instance, that uses women in underwear that are round, etc. So it's more recent changes are happening. So this is a good segment of the book, which has really to do with the transformation, the destigmatization of marginalized group. I'll conclude by telling you a few words about the Gen Zs. These college students between the age of 18 and 22 whom we interviewed, and we were trying to understand how do they perceive the social challenges that they encounter, and what solutions do they see, and what kind of society they would like to live in. And we produced a few papers from this data. One has to do with social resilience. How do they understand how they can gain hope? And these interviews certainly underscore the ways in which they draw inspiration from one another, from their peers, from their cohort, but they also draw inspiration from popular figures, from politicians such as Bernie Sanders, and people like Lady Gaga, who are, really celebrating a society that is more equal. And for that generation, the notion of accepting non-conforming sexual identification, which was not at all an issue for my generation, has become extremely central for them. They largely focus on race and sexuality. They don't talk much about class. It would be very interesting to know if their counterparts in the UK or in Europe are more focused on class, but in the American case, they are not. So looking closely at our interviews, we found that well, first, let me mention that these labels of Gen Z and millennials, demographers are quite critical of them, because they say, well, these groups are just invention from marketing firms and also from the media. They don't exist for real. It's very difficult, demographers argue, to separate what is due to cohort, to period, to age. So let's not use these categories. But in fact, these young people very much self-identified as Gen Zs and millennials. And they are generations that are founded around events. So for the millennials, the 2008 recession was a very crucial experience. And for the Gen Zs, most likely, the fact that they became adults during COVID will have a lasting influence on their worldview. They were, dubbed Gen Zs in part because it's the first generation that was born when the phone, our phones existed. So it really transformed their worldview. So these groups became extremely salient, as you can see here in US print media. So the group exists even if it's not, a group that demographers like to use. to focus on. So it's a group that is really coming of age in a period of deep uncertainty at the time when they're doing all the transition, leaving their parents' home, trying to decide what their occupation will be, try to find a partner. So the question of how they project themselves into the future is just extremely challenging, and this is the context in which we interviewed them. And also at the time when they say, we are in the cockpit now, they are very critical of my generation, the boomers. They think that we really screwed things up by destroying the environment. We lived in a period of prosperity, and we were not very good guardian of the environment, so they're just extremely upset at our generation. And of course, boomers believe that we led the sexual revolution, we led second wave feminism. We think of ourselves as a generation which was very much engaged in social change. And they tend to think that they're inventing social change, which creates some tensions between the generations. So in one of our papers, we studied the ways in which the Gen Zs are braiding repertoires. So what they're doing is really drawing on some elements of the American dream and neoliberalism. They don't embrace competitiveness, they hate competitiveness, but they embrace the notion of hard work and of having a very entrepreneurial attitude toward their own life. They think that their fate is in their hand, and it's important to really be focused on achieving things. So they have an entrepreneurial attitude, but they also embrace something that my generation was not attuned to, which is the therapeutic ethos, the notion that they want to have a balanced life, they want to take care of their mental health. When I was a student, we didn't even know that mental health existed. It was deeply stigmatized. People just worked very hard and were quite merciless toward themselves in their focus on their objectives. So they are really trying to combine these various objectives. They also embrace what I called ordinary cosmopolitanism, in that they really celebrate, as I said earlier, sexual nonconformity, and they want, humans are humans is very central to their worldview. And finally, they embrace this Gen Z cohort narrative that has to do with we're here to change the world, and okay, boomers, move to the side. We have things to do here. So in one of our articles, we compare what are the elements from these very influential cultural repertoires that they are keeping and which one they are replacing, and how they come with new themes that are central to recognition. So the recognition of plurality of life path, the fact that there's many different kinds of people who are valuable. You don't have to be professionally successful to be valuable. So in many ways rejecting some of the beliefs that their parent held in terms of social success. And they put a lot of emphasis on communal participation, especially in the context of COVID. Many young people who were focused on kind of living the American dream are now defining their vocation very much in terms of giving to the community, redefining their path in various ways. So in some ways, they have an expanded vision of the American dream. They don't reject it entirely, but they certainly reject the sole focus on anti-materialism. There's different reaction among the working class and the middle class students. The middle class students are very much focused on kindness as a tool for social change. They have an understanding of the crisis as new, whereas the working class students think we've been in crisis forever. Their parents have been hit very badly by the 2008 recession. They don't think they will become leaders, whereas many middle class students have a conception of their agency that is much more powerful, and they think that they will be able to address social problems, which is less frequent in the working class. And at the same time, the working class is promoting is saying, well, these are power struggle, there will be conflicts, and we have to call out people. So if you want, elements of the cancel culture are very present in the interviews that we conducted with the working class students. Half of our sample is working class, whereas in the middle class students, they talk much more about the importance of kindness and empathy. So they think that their agency is much more important in creating a new society. My argument is in part in contrast to this focus on empathy, that we need to create societies that has the tool we need to enable social change and to help people create the kind of society they want to live in. So, this is my research team. I want to thank all of them who contributed to developing this project, which has been extremely time-consuming for the last few years. And I think I will stop here. I'm not sure that the clock stopped working, so I don't know how much time I have left, but I will stop here, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, dear Michèle, thanks so much for a very engaging lecture, which started off by painting a bit of a grim picture of the current state of the American dream, but then turned towards a much more hopeful story, showing that there are many new narratives of hope being produced, especially among the younger generations. I have here a list of questions that have been posted through the chat function. At least that's what I supposed. But I don't see any questions, so probably that means that there have not been posed any questions yet. But of course there is an opportunity for the public present here to ask questions as well. So yes, please.
Yes, you mentioned that class doesn't seem to be so important. You mentioned that class doesn't seem to be so important for the newer generations. At the same time, you said that their feeling of their own agency differs very much between classes. Is this then something that they are not aware of, or how do they handle this?
Well, we know that over the last 2 decades, the extent to which the upper middle class lives in isolation from other classes has grown enormously. The spatial segregation of American society has grown enormously between class, but also between race. So they understand less and less the way in which their life is structured by class. So the fact that when you interview them about the kind of society they want to live in, they're mostly concerned with sexuality and race is not that surprising, since they largely ignore the way in which their life is different from those of other classes. At the same time, it doesn't mean that the social determinants are not there. So therefore, we find very different patterns across the groups. So the two findings are not incompatible. They just, you know, people can be...
But do they then themselves feel that their agency is different depending on race and sexual identity? Or?
No. I think that in part due to the impact of these agents of change, they very much perceive that there's a need to be much more inclusive on these dimensions. But the media do not diffuse systematically messages of inclusion on the basis of class. So it's rare that you have shows that tells you the working class is valuable. The Ford Foundation was invested in the production of the film Roma that won Caesar a few years ago, and that portrayed the life of maids in Mexico City and showed them to us as, you know, making decisions about abortion, for instance, whereas typically there's no stories about maids. So there's a few other shows like this that are depicting working class people in a three-dimensional way, but they remain quite exceptional. So.
Thank you.
There's one question there as well.
Good afternoon, thank you very much. In your lecture, you focus very much on changing hearts and minds of people through narratives. And I think it's super important, but the question that I have is it enough? And a known slogan that I had to think about, often attributed to the work of Nancy Fraser, is there's no recognition without redistribution. Based on your research, do you think this is true, yes or no? But a bit broader, my question is about which other things do you need, like laws or redistribution, etc.
Yeah, I think our societies are extremely well equipped to think about distribution, in part because economists are extremely influential in shaping the public sphere. I think even more in the US than it is the case here. So my students, for instance, rarely think about recognition, but they think that, you know, the structural dimension of social life is what matters most. So this is very much at the center of my work, in the sense that the first few pages of the book say distribution matters. It is not, I'm not trying to prove the opposite, but I really, since the semiotic aspect of social life is omnipresent, but the population truly doesn't have the tools to think about scripts of self, for instance. This is not the notion that most people are familiar with, and yet it structures our life in an extremely powerful way. So my objective is to make this visible. So in this sense, I agree with Nancy Fraser, but she's a philosopher. She doesn't know, or she doesn't study how this actually happens, which is precisely what I'm trying to do. You know, my agenda for the last few years has been to develop an empirical sociology of recognition, which is precisely what Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth didn't do. So, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I don't know how to phrase my question, but on the slides was mentioned the importance of the wars of moral values and morality. And, okay, I don't want to be a defender of neoliberal ideas, but the easy thing, you know, about this neoliberal framework is that, you know, getting rich and doing it by yourself is a pretty easy way to measure. Whereas if you start talking about moral values and morality, well, I can see hard discussions coming up, and we already do have hard discussions in at least European societies, but North America as well, you know, on like what is moral and what is not moral, and who is dealing in a moral way. So while I see the importance of it, I also see the challenge of how to then deal with it as a society and to find then what we would deem like good moral values and not, you know? Do you have any more information about that?
Sure. So when I was working on my second book, titled The Dignity of Working Man, I did a lot of interviews with North African immigrants in Paris, and I asked them what makes people equal. And they said, well, we all get up in the morning to buy our bread, we're all the children of God, we all spend 9 months in our mother's womb, we're all equally insignificant at the cosmological level. That's not the words they use, but they said we're all like clouds passing in the sky. And a lot of what their answers had to do with our essential similarities as human being, our fate as human being. And most importantly, there's good and bad people in our races. And them, you know, them pointing to the Quran and the similarity with the 10 the 10 commandments, etc. And a lot of this has to do with treating other people with kindness and respect. So their measure of morality is not work ethic, it's the ability to treat other people with decency. So these are kind of you know, principles of morality that are at odds with each other. And in this book, I contrast working class white and black workers, and I argued that the white workers were very much embracing what I called then the disciplined self, whereas African American embrace what I call the moral self, which has to, the caring self, sorry, which has to do with treating people with kindness. And their boundaries toward white people was to say, white people are not very much in touch with the human thing. You know, they mostly want to dominate, they're disciplined, they're not, you know, they're not caring. So, and they very much define their collective identity as African Americans in terms of being caring. So that would be an alternative. When I talk about a plurality of concept of values, that's precisely what I'm kind of pointing at. But I need to make this even more explicit, your question suggests. Thank you.
Okay, I see we have maybe one last question there. Yes.
So thank you for your presentation. You see in certain countries an increase in commons initiatives. So how do you, can you put that in context of your empirical findings, or do you see that more as a marginal development if you put that in a broader perspective of your findings?
Mm-hmm. Well, that means different things in different contexts. So can you specify what it means in this context here?
That could be a very long story, probably. But yeah, you would have different initiatives, bottom-up initiatives by citizens, either in setting up common childcare or changing the neighborhood. It could be also taking care of waste, but at least taking common initiatives, bottom-up initiatives that could be supported by the state to a certain extent. But well, I see a lot of commonalities in the values that you're describing, but some people here would also present it more as a marginal development. So I was wondering how to sort of match these developments with your findings.
Well, in the American context, a lot of those who are involved in social movements are middle-class people. A recent study showed that only 7% of working-class people are involved in collective social movements. So that would presume, like, the bottom-up is in fact already extremely selective, which is one of the reasons I'm not interviewing people who are part of social movement. The ordinary people, the bottom-up in this study are the Gen Zs, and I decided not to, what we call sample on the dependent variable, that is precisely go after people who are part of social movements, because then you miss, you know, in the American context, the question of those who are undecided, the moderates, those who don't vote, there's a tug of war to get them to join your side, you know, and one reason they don't vote is that many code social participation voting as a form of class privilege that they don't want to be part. There's also the people who don't want to be part of mainstream society, who are not part of this story to the extent that many of them are not college educated, and I study. I mean, this is really focused on the liberal and progressive end of the political spectrum. I would need another project altogether to look at the far right and conservatives who are producing the backlash. But I mean, you're right to mention that the general spirit of you know, this social movement is very much one of self-organization and, you know, people taking their life in their hands around principles of equality, and also, you know, counterpart to bureaucracies and specialization in the life of experts. And so that's a very good point.
Okay, in the meantime, I have received 2 questions from the public at home, so I'll quickly read them. First one is, what is the impact of categorization of workers as knowledge workers or creative class, or non-knowledge workers in creating stigmatization? So the question is, should we continue with such categorization of workers, with such a depiction? The second question, maybe I can also read that, is can you expand a bit on the relation between the effective polarization in the US and the struggle for recognition? So I think we have a couple of minutes left to elaborate on one or both questions as you like.
Well, those are big questions. So the question on knowledge workers, this is a way to designate professionals. They are very much featured in the story I told about reducing stigma, because the case studies that we use to write this paper very much shows the ways in which medical workers, lawyers, social scientists, journalists are absolutely crucial in reframing these groups. So, of course, the workers who are technical workers are also knowledge workers, but they're not operating at the level of creating new script as much as those who are certified as experts. So there again, having a college degree is extremely crucial, but we know that we live in a moment where expertise is is highly contested. We have, the crisis of expertise is visible in journalism, in our own field, around, the COVID crisis. So this question does not surprise me in this respect, and a lot of young people are contesting. My own graduate student undergrads want me to lecture on my power as a professor. They are very much into questioning, I think, the power of academics, and this is extremely salient in their mind. So there's, at the same time, the enterprise of knowledge production wants to be a democratic enterprise. Peer review is that we're supposed to challenge each other, but it's democratic among peers. So by definition, it's extremely elitist, and it's hard to know, since it takes us decades to develop the knowledge we need to evaluate each other's work. It cannot, in my opinion, become democratic, and that's the paradox of academic life. You cannot be fully democratic given how long it takes to accumulate knowledge. And for many people, they think that we're a little bit like the Catholic Church with pedophilia. We should not be judging ourselves, because then we come to function as a self-protective corporation, and it comes with many, many problems. So I sympathize with the question, but it's hard to imagine. At the same time, workers produce alternative forms of knowledge that are extremely important. And in the book, The Dignity of Working Man, I certainly show how their estimation of people's value is very much driven by whether or not you treat people fairly, a sense of common decency that is absolutely crucial to them. So they have their own way of knowing that I think totally deserve respect. What was the second question?
The second question was about relation between the polarization in the
yes.
US.
Okay.
That's a really big one.
Yeah. Well, one of our former graduate students, Noam Gidron, produced a comparative study of affective polarization across a number of advanced industrial society, and shows that it's not more acute in the US than elsewhere. At the same time, the studies I know of the American case is that the difference in policies between Democrats and Republicans has not changed that much over the last decades, and yet the two groups dislike each other much more intensely, and most of that is based on emotion. So on questions such as, would you have friends who are from the other party, the distance has grown much more acute. I think what the book tries to do is really, the conclusion, which I'm finishing now, is very much about, what each group should do to make group boundaries more porous. And I have a section that says where middle-class people should be much more aware of their arrogance when they define people's worth based on their education, especially, and also income. And white people should also, become also much more aware of how they reproduce white privilege. So there's many ways in which this affective polarization, we are feeding it. The professional and managerial class can be extremely arrogant. The way we talk, for instance, about Trump supporters, not fully understanding the way in which we're feeding this, the echo chambers. And the current governor of Florida, his whole agenda for the next election is precisely anti-lib, libtard, that's us. That's me, trying to very systematically develop policies. So that's why he's attacking critical race theory and, notions of progressive educations that are defended by many. So I think we have an election in November, and the Republicans are very much set in taking control of the Senate, and a lot of the what's at stake revolves around the capacity for Democrats to understand better why the working class is voting against Democrat. And I think developing greater awareness and reflexivity about how the Democratic Party and the progressive and liberals are feeding the echo chambers is absolutely crucial. And it's partly what the book wants to accomplish. It's very difficult because you kind of sound naive when you say, we need a conversation about this, but it's hard to understand what other concrete actions can be taken above and beyond self-awareness. So
Okay, thank you so much, Michèle, for all
My
your
pleasure.
clear answers. And thanks to the public for all the questions. And I think we will proceed with the ceremony now.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can sit for just a second. Thank you so much, Professor Lamont, for your inspiring masterclass. It is now time to confer the honorary degree, indeed. Nominator Professor Gert Verschragen will deliver the laudation before the official conferral, and afterwards the honorary doctor gives her own words of thanks.
While sociologists have long studied social inequality as a question of redistribution of income, housing, health, and so on, Michèle Lamont's work was one of the first to systematically investigate the cultural dimensions of inequality. By comparing how people in different social settings make sense of their own social identity and how they distinguish themselves from others, her work has pushed us to think deeper about the complex interrelationships between culture and inequality. While Dr. Lamont's work on culture and inequality mostly consists of rigorous cross-national empirical studies, her theoretical work on symbolic boundaries and cultural classification has also been very influential. In the past decades, Professor Lamont's thinking on symbolic boundary work has been applied to a wide range of fundamental sociological questions and has inspired scholars throughout the globe, including myself. As you've all witnessed today, the scientific work of Michèle Lamont is also motivated by a clear social and political responsibility. While discrimination and stigma may be a fact of life for many marginalized groups in our societies, at least her many books and articles have given us a richer and more nuanced understanding of the different mechanisms involved and of how our societies can work towards greater inclusion of historically disadvantaged groups. Professor Lamont has often emphasized the important role that social scientists can play here by using their specific theoretical and methodological equipment. Social scientists can ask questions that are not being asked in the current public sphere, and in this way contribute to a richer and more pluralist democracy. It is telling that Michèle Lamont has also extended her work concerning values and cultural pluralism to examine her own professional environment within the university system. In your book, How Professors Think, you have identified the criteria that are used to define scientific value instead of social value. So how do we evaluate research that is done in the different scientific disciplines? And you have shown that there are many definitions of scientific quality and that they vary between different disciplinary cultures. In other words, you have investigated the conditions for successful interdisciplinary collaboration, which is not an easy task given the broad variety of epistemic and disciplinary cultures that exist. So Michèle, the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Antwerp highly values your sociological work, as well as your many efforts to reach beyond your own discipline. And we would like to applaud you for your highly reflexive but also engaged way of doing social science and for your many contributions to the public sphere. So, both for your groundbreaking scholarly work in cultural and comparative sociology, your contribution to public debates on recognition and social inclusion, and your reflections on the role of the social sciences in shaping our future societies, I request that the Rector honors Professor Michèle Lamont with an honorary degree from the University of Antwerp. Thank you.
No, you go there.
Een beetje.
Thank you. Yes. Here we are. Ladies and gentlemen, on the recommendation of the Faculty of Social Sciences and by decision of the Executive Board, the University of Antwerp confers upon Professor Michèle Lamont, Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies, Professor of Sociology and of African and African American Studies on Harvard University, the degree of Doctor Honoris Causa in Social Science, for her contributions to cultural and comparative sociology, which have significantly deepened our understanding of the relation between culture and equality, and to public debates on pluralism, racism, stigmatization, and the role of social sciences in shaping our future societies. Dear Doctor, hereby I confer you the epitoga of our university, and you have already a lot of diplomas, but this is a new one.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
I greatly appreciate
Congratulations.
it. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
And let me also say, as a rector, how happy I am that we have now the opportunity for this Dr. Honoris Causa degree. Our university here in the city was located in an environment with much poverty. It was a poor quarter with poor people living here. The university came here in a kind of gentrification. The rich men wiped the poor men out. We studied them. We worked out a department of sociology studying poverty and inequality, now linked with culture. I found it striking, this analysis. Thank you very much for this. May I invite you now to say some
few words.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So, dear Rector, Dean, colleagues, friends, and students, it is with great pleasure that I find myself among you today to be granted this great mark of distinction that is an honorary doctorate from your university. When I received the call from my colleague Gert Verschagen telling me the wonderful news, I found myself quite moved. So I'm proud of being honored in this way by your faculty for several reasons. One is the important research that is being conducted here, particularly in my field of cultural sociology. So colleagues such as Gert are producing creative studies of the boundary work performed between immigrants and native Belgian citizens here in Antwerp, at a time when your country is experiencing the growing influence of ethno-nationalism. He's also studying how children and teenagers are learning about diversity and racism. So these topics of our enormous urgency, not only in Belgium and in Europe more generally, but also, of course, in North America. I'm also pleased by this honor because I feel more than ever the need to strengthen the relationships between social scientists in North America and Europe at a time when our societies are experiencing parallel challenges concerning threat to democracy, especially in the context of this war in Ukraine. So I hope that this visit will contribute to the pressing needs of strengthening these intellectual collaboration. A third and really more personal reason for being proud of this honorary degree There's something very special about being honored by the University of Antwerp, since this is the city from where my paternal great-great-grandfather and grandmother were born and hailed before moving to Canada. So Désiré Edmond Tréau de Soily, and I was told this is a very Belgian name, was a commercial attaché to the Belgian embassy in Ottawa. So he was charged with the settlement of many Belgians in the Vallée de la Gatineau, the region of Ottawa, the national capital, in the second half of the 19th century, at the time when many of your compatriots had to immigrate due to difficult local conditions here in Belgium. We have oil paintings of him and his wife, Janet Martin van Soon, in our living room, which means that they have accompanied us, my husband and I, for 3 decades as we have been raising our kids. And they look over us daily. So for this reason, it is with particular excitement that we will be visiting the Museum of Immigration tomorrow afternoon. I look forward to learning more about this. Finally, for me, this honorary degree strengthened my own resolve to produce research that is socially meaningful and that contributes to diffusing the analytical tools that citizens need in societies such as Quebec and Belgium. Where linguistic and ethnic boundaries are so salient in our daily lives. And I've learned a lot from discussing with colleagues over the last few days about the similarities and the differences. We've all experienced the power of collective identities and how linguistic communities come to believe that their prosperity is limited by zero-sum dynamics. So with my talk, I hope to have contributed to convincing you that each group can shine under different light at the same time, and that our collective well-being can grow in symbiosis. So these are only a few of the reasons why I'm simply enormously grateful to have been chosen for this honor. And I want again to express my most sincere appreciation for the invitation and for your gracious hospitality. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh. Maybe the picture first, or? Okay, good. I disappear.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
We invite you to... We have a little reception behind.
Yes.
Wait, I have something to say.
I'm sorry.
Yes, I would like to finish this afternoon by saying even a few more words of thanks. So thank you again, Professor Michèle Lamont, for all the incredible and important work that you are doing, for the extremely interesting masterclass. I followed it to you backstage, and also for accepting our honorary degree, of course. And next to every successful woman is a strong man, or another strong woman, or a strong non-binary person, or just another valuable person. And in this case, it's Frank Dobbin, and we have a little surprise for you to thank you for being here this afternoon. It's chocolate. Thank you also to Rector Herman van Goetem, to Dean Petra Meijer, to nominator Gert Verschragen, and thank you to the Faculty of Social Sciences. Finally, of course, I'd also like to thank you for all being here, for watching with us online. This was the University of Antwerp's final honorary degree for 20 and 22, so I hope to see you again in 20 and 23. And now it's time for the reception.